Not to make a big stink about it, but the entire premise of this franchise, for as long as it lasted, is that someone named Dr. Brown builds a time machine and uses it to have 8 historical people beat the crud out of each other. And I honestly don't know where I was going with that, so I figured somebody can figure that one out. Anyways. World Heroes, released in 1993 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System courtesy of Sunsoft, was the lower cost, lower quality alternative for those who couldn't afford Neo Geo home arcade machines. And I would imagine that's quite a significant number of people considering how expensive that stuff was, and still is, quite frankly. So if you were one of those poor souls who couldn't afford a Neo Geo machine in either arcade or home console format, you had to settle for the ports on the more affordable 16-bit consoles, some of which would turn out questionable, and lo and behold, World Heroes on SNES is not one of them. No, this one's actually not bad. Not quite the strongest 16-bit conversion of a Neo Geo release, and honestly, not exactly a spectacular fighter on its own accord, but still a respectable showing and certainly a far cry from the depressing Genesis port that would come along a year later. Anyway, as a refresher of sorts, World Heroes gives you 8 fighters to choose from, all of them plucked from different points in history, and almost all of them fulfilling some sort of trope or stereotype. None of them particularly boring though, save for the 2 ninjas who serve as your obligatory Ryukin analogies. From there, you have the option of competing in standard matches that take place in unique stages around the world but play out like any fighting game would. Beat the crap out of each other, 2 out of 3 rounds, that sort of thing. Or you can compete in what was once dubbed death matches, but because of Nintendo of America censorship issues are now redubbed fatal matches, because that doesn't sound traumatizing at all. Either way, you're fighting in arenas surrounded by either spiked walls or ropes infused with flames or electricity, among other things, and touching any of these things will cause harm, which means having to work around these additional hazards that, if nothing else, do a good enough job of freshening things up and making fights more interesting. There's even hair versus hair matches, because that's also fatal, is a loss of hair. This SNES port gives you all 8 playable fighters to choose from, 8 difficulty settings, and 2 controller options. You could either stick with the original 3-button arcade setup of pressure-sensitive punch and kick buttons along with a throw button, or you could set it to work with 2 buttons and 2 kick buttons, and the bumpers are for throwing. In other words, using all the buttons on your SNES controller. Either way works, and either way you go, controls are actually fairly responsive in this port, and pulling off moves for the most part shouldn't be too much of a problem if you know the proper inputs. Though the game does have some issues recognizing some Dragon Punch type motions, seems you need a little more proper timing with those, but other than that, it's a perfectly fine playing game with some fun unique characters to sample out. Or you could just take the Kung Fu guy and watch him maul everyone with his simple kicks and stuff. World Heroes on SNES ain't too bad looking. Sure, the character sprites have been shrunk down considerably, it's not quite as animated as the Neo Geo original, and the font looks like it may have been ripped from Capcom's own port of Street Fighter 2. Amazed there was no lawsuit there. But the backgrounds look fine for the most part. Some characters do look good despite the reduction in size and quality, others a little more questionable, but not too bad. And the heads-up display looks halfway decent and not bare-bones cheap like the later Genesis port. Again, not the biggest blowaway of visual flair, but it does get the job done somewhat, and it looks halfway decent. On the other hand, I'm not quite high on the sound output in this port. The sound effects aren't too bad, the punches and impacts sound alright for the most part, and the voice bites are fairly clear with some echo to them, but the music, generally speaking, is rather lackluster, sounding either too basic by SNES standards, or sometimes just bland in general. Not to say that World Heroes had a classic soundtrack that sticks in its original version, but this SNES port doesn't really do those songs justice. That said, this port doesn't possess the ear-grating quality of its Genesis counterpart, so by default, it's the better sounding game, but that's not exactly high praise whatsoever. Overall, World Heroes for Super Nintendo is above average fare. It may be light on features, it may be lacking in musical quality, and as a home conversion it's not quite ideal, but it's its own thing compared to other SNES fighters. It is perhaps one of the more competent fighting offerings on the console, and the fatal matches do add some flavor to an otherwise average fighter. All in all, this is one worth checking out. Or at least it would have been, if the sequel wasn't so goddamn better.